So doing that.
Yeah, where is Mr. Michael Dias and Saurabh?
Yes, I'm here.
Great, great.
Yes, sir,
Nice
I am here too.
Thank you,
Great to see. I have
Saurabh.
been
Thank
listening
you,
to.
Michael.
Yes.
So Alok sir will be joining in a while.
We'll be joining. Okay. So,
My video is not on. Kashish, could you please put
Yes, sir.
the
Yes,
video on?
please. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm on now.
great. So, friends, I welcome you to this very important session on labor law reforms. I think most of us are aware, either as entrepreneurs or as professionals, about the new laws which have been put in place by our legislature, that's famously now called the Four Codes. And as Justice Mukandam Sharma said in his inaugural address, the codes are in place, but the subordinate legislation is not in place. The rules are in the process of being drafted. And there was an announcement some time back by the Government of India, Ministry of Labour, that the codes with the rules would be implemented with effect from 1st April 2021. I don't know whether it is achievable or not, because still we have not seen the fine print and the final version of the rules. At least I have not seen. Possibly my other eminent colleagues in the panel would can throw more light on that. Earlier we had nearly 54 laws which were in place, covered under a general description of labor laws, both central laws and the state laws. Prominent being, you see, those pertaining to resolution of disputes, that is the Industrial Disputes Act, and then laws pertaining to service conditions in industrial establishments, that is the Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act. Then, of course, important laws pertaining to regulation of wages, like Minimum Wages Act and the Payment of Wages Act, and of course, then the uh, long-term retirement benefits laws like gratuity, provident fund, and all that. Now, all these have been codified into four codes, these different laws. What I'm going to request my panelists is, because since we are discussing this issue for the first time, I think our eminent panelists would have formulated certain views on what is relevant so far as the present codes are concerned, how far these codes have improved upon the existing laws, if at all there is an improvement. That is one area where I would like to hear our very eminent panelists, that whether these codes have improved upon the existing laws, if so, to what extent? And will these four codes prove to be beneficial so far as our working force, the workers are concerned? Second question which I will pose, you see, to the eminent panelist is, the as again Honorable Justice Mukandam Sharma said, the subject of labor laws is in the concurrent list. That is Schedule 7, List 3, concurrent list, item 22, 23, 24. Now, what happens if there is a conflict, you see, between the codes and the rules on one side and the state legislations on the other side. I am particularly referring to provisions regarding, say, minimum wages. Under the code, the central government has taken the authority to fix a certain basic minimum wage. So no one can go below that wage. But then it is again open to the states, to even increase those minimum wages to whatever they want to do. Now, what would be the position, legal position with regard to that? And then again, because these are either governed by the, I think mainly governed by the Shops and Establishments Act, which is purely in the domain of the states, state legislatures. What will be the position about the working hours, about the rest intervals and the closing hours and overtime for working in excess? Where would these laws stand if there is a conflict, between the Shops and Establishments Act and the central legislations? So, personally speaking, I would like our panelists to enlighten us on these issues, but of course, they may have formed their own perspectives, their own understanding of the labor laws, and we would like to be benefited, by their views on this. We have very eminent panelists, Mr. Michael Dias. He's a very senior eminent lawyer and also happens to be the secretary of the Employers Association, which was established in 1986. He's also an executive member of the governing body of All India Organization of Employers and has represented Indian employers on national labor tripartite fora, as also on committees constituted by the ILO in India and overseas. So he's, I would call him, my contemporary. We go back, decades together, working in this area of specialization. So it will be my pleasure to request Mr. Michael Dias to make his presentation, and I would request every speaker to speak for not more than 20 minutes in their presentation, then leaving some time for internal discussions, inter se, among the panelists and also from participants. Thank you. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Dr. Lalit. Very kind of you to have me this morning on the panel. It is my pleasure, privilege to share my thoughts because I have had the privilege of pioneering this change, representing employers on various government committees from time to time, beginning with the Second National Commission on Labor way back in 1999. Having said that, I would, Dr. Lalit, like to address the questions you have raised, and then I would like to do a little deep dive into a few of the codes, primarily the Industrial Relations Code, as also the Social Security Code. However, with regard to the point number one you raised with regards to implementation, you are absolutely right that the Ministry of Labor and Employment had assured that the new codes would be operational April 1, 2021. However, because of the state elections, various states are in election mode at this point of time. And secondly, because the state governments have yet not formulated their rules. So they are awaiting these newer developments before which the implementation would come. Your second question, Dr. Lalit, is with regards to have the codes improved and to what extent? Well, let me be honest with you, because I've been a pioneer in this entire work. I would believe that although a lot of people talk of the new codes as being cut and paste job, and some of them say that even it's a poor cut and paste job, Notwithstanding that, I would still say that what we have gone through over the years, it's a refreshing change. And in my presentation, I will try and share some of my thoughts as to how the new situation is developing and how it is better than before. Question is whether it is more beneficial to stakeholders. Prima facie, to begin with, I would say yes, but obviously we'll need to wait for the years ahead to see how it sort of merges and how it develops. Your last point, Dr. Lalit, was with regard to the conflict between state legislatures and the newer codes, that is your Shops and Establishment Act. We do see that there is a fair amount of disconnect between the two, but my own interactions with the ministry on behalf of Indian employers over the last couple of weeks, the message that I have got is that none less than the Prime Minister himself is concerned about it. I mean, this issue about how do you define wages, how do you implement wages? I am told by my friends in the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, that a meeting is lined up with none less than the Prime Minister himself, and they are trying to find solutions to get more clarity. Having said that, I would believe the first big, major, fundamental change in labor laws, or more specifically, the Industrial Disputes Act. You see, Lalit, you would recall the days when we were practicing initially, when we would jokingly say, while waiting for our cases, that it is easier to divorce your wife, even under the Hindu law, rather than to get rid of an industrial worker. Well, those days, I think, are now over. The first thing I would like to address is the fixed term employment. The engagement of a worker on the basis of a written contract of employment for a fixed period, provided that his hours of work, wages, allowances, and other benefits shall not be less than that of a permanent worker doing the same work or work of a similar nature. Such a fixed term employee shall be eligible for all statutory benefits, including gratuity, if he renders services under the contract for a period of 1 year. Now, this provision, to my mind, is a game changer. This is going to change the entire matrix of the employer-employee relationship. And here I'm more focusing on the industrial worker, which you would recall that if an industrial worker had put in 240 days or more of continuous service, I'm referring to the current Section 25 capital B of the ID Act, which would say that it is deemed that he is in permanent and regular service. This basic precept has been attacked, and therefore, once these codes are in place, I would believe the new appointment letters issued by an employer to a worker would all be on fixed term employment basis, which means the current practice is you hire a person, he or she continues in your services till they attain the age of retirement. That scenario will not carry on. So I think this is a very major game changer in the relationship at the workplace. The second thing that I would like to draw your attention to is the Chapter 2 of the Industrial Relations Code, which talks about bipartite forums. One bipartite forum is the Works Committee, which is directly related to the workplace environment, more so in the factories and manufacturing setup, but even in the service sector, because the law says if you have 100 or more workers, you need to have a Works Committee. Besides the Works Committee, which will focus on the equipment, machinery, the environment at the workplace, that would be the focus of the Works Committee. They have also focused on a grievance redressal committee. Now, I know a lot of you would say that the existing Section 9 capital C of the ID Act also provides for a grievance redressal committee. But my vision of the code is that the GRC henceforth will be a fairly powerful tool at the workplace. And if I may be permitted to draw a parallel that we all see since the year 2013, you would recall that in the year 2013, the sexual harassment of women at workplace was enacted. Under that legislation, it is mandatory for the employer to have an internal complaints committee, which means that an aggrieved woman can approach the forum, lodge a complaint, get the matter investigated, and appropriate punishment is done. There, obviously, things like confidentiality and such other things are given a very high priority. But between 2013 and 2021, one would say in this country, the sexual harassment law has taken off reasonably well. Maybe we have many more milestones to achieve. It is in the same context that I would say that what the new law says with regard to grievance redressal committees, it says that 20 or more workers, you have to have equal number of representatives of employers and workers to be chosen in a prescribed manner. The chairperson to the grievance redressal committee will alternate on a rotational basis every year, which means 1 year there is an employer representative, the next year there is a worker representative who is the chairperson. The total number of members is not to exceed 10. This number has been deliberately kept at that figure just to ensure that work gets done. It is not a very large committee. Adequate representation of women workers. Let me share with the entire audience that women workers in the future are being given a very important place and position. To give you an illustration, if it is a matter of working overtime, you cannot ipso facto automatically ask a female worker to work beyond her normal working hours. She has to consent to do work beyond the normal working hours. The employer is mandated to ensure safety and security of the women workers at the workplace to ensure that they get back home safely. So women issues would be fairly major focused in the codes. Coming back to the grievance redressal committee, it says that an application will be done within 1 year from the date on which the cause of action arose. So it is not that you can raise a complaint or a grievance which is belated or more than a year old. In fact, let me make one issue very clear. In all the codes now, the statute strongly emphasizes on doing things in a time-bound manner, and prescriptions of limitation laws are coming in very, very strongly. Therefore, the grievance redressal committee has to complete its proceedings within 30 days. Decisions of the grievance redressal committee on the basis of majority view of the committee. So it is not a one person's decision, it is a majority view. And as I shared with you, you have representatives both from employers and workers. Then the workers may appeal within 60 days to the conciliation officer through their trade union. So a dispute in conciliation now would have to be routed through the grievance redressal committee. To my mind, this would be a major game changer. The employer, the management, the HR system in the organization will have to be very nimble-footed to address promptly, immediately, satisfactorily grievances. And let me caution you, friends, as a representative of FICCI and the All India Organization of Employers, we did submit to government to give a definition of what the word grievance means. Regrettably, there is no prescribed definition in the statute, which means we as lawyers would necessarily have to look up the dictionary meaning of grievance. And as you all know, the word grievance has a very wide meaning and connotation. Therefore, a whole variety of disputes could be raised by the workers at the workplace in terms of a grievance. I now move on to chapter 3 of the Industrial Relations Code, which deals with trade unions. My own thoughts on the subject is that under the IR code now, there will be a big boost available to trade unions and to employers for collective bargaining. I do believe that collective bargaining will be the new mantra at the workplace. And here I'm specifically referring to section 14 that talks about recognition of a negotiating union or a negotiating council. You see, where there is one trade union functioning, having majority support, it is fine, because then the employer shall recognize such a trade union as the sole negotiating union of the workers. However, the statute provides that, let us assume one trade union gets 40% representation and the other gets 20 and another gets say 25 or 30, then all these people would be proportionately on the sole negotiating committee to discuss matters with the trade unions. You see, the earlier position was if you just got even 37% and the others all got lesser than you because of multiplicity of trade unions, that phenomenon now would change. It will be far more democratic for the trade unions. Section 14(7) makes it mandatory for the employer to provide facilities to a negotiating union or a negotiating council. So I look at the trade union being revived in an appropriate manner with good direction for the trade union. Obviously, the employer would have an important role to play. Obviously not a direct role, but will play a very major supporting role to ensure harmony at the workplace and amicable working conditions. I move on to chapter 4 that deals with standing orders. As we all know, that the standing order law basically sets the working conditions. So whether it is your type of workers you have, the type of misconduct you have, the type of workers in terms of temporary, permanent workers, their hours of work, leaves, holidays, and all such other matters would be applicable. The good thing in the new code is that the code has now provided in the rules 3 sets of model standing orders. One model standing orders is for the manufacturing sector, another is for the service sector, and the third is for mines. The standing orders, the model standing orders, broadly set down the terms and conditions of employment at the workplace. Now it is simple for the employer, if he finds that the terms mentioned in the model standing orders are adequate and that they meet the needs and requirements of his establishment, they could simply write to the certifying officer that they would be following the same model standing orders without anything ado. However, if you want to formulate your own standing orders because of the unique nature of work, say you are in the banking industry or you're in the aviation industry and you have some specific needs and requirements, you definitely can have standing orders made. However, now they have made it mandatory to an industrial establishment employing 300 or more workers. If you have less than 300 workers, it is not mandatory for you to have standing orders. Section 29 of this code also says that the government shall frame model standing orders. The employer may choose to follow them and therefore need not get separate standing orders certified. Section 38 provides for a time limit for completing disciplinary proceedings and liability to pay subsistence allowance, which is 90 days from suspension. Earlier, professional friends would recall that a domestic inquiry would carry on for months, if not years, before it would come to an end. Now it is mandated in the law that within 90 days it would be done. Similarly, the subsistence allowance is also clearly provided in the code, which would be payable. Also, assuming if you have submitted your standing orders for certifying to the certification officer and you find that he is not doing it within a certain time, there are provisions of automatic coverage. Then to quickly deal with the good old Chapter 5B of the ID Act no longer exists, under which it was only 100 workers or more. You had to necessarily, for cases of layoff, retrenchment, closure, get permission from government. Mercifully, that is now behind us. Now the provision is 300 workers or more. And of course, if you are in the service sector, even then these provisions would not be applicable. Then another good provision, as I look at it, in the Industrial Relations Code is the worker reskilling fund that is to be contributed to by the employers of the industrial establishment. The government, of course, will come out with more specific details as to how to take it forward. Lalit, as I look at my clock, it's 11:52. And based on what you told me, I only have 3 minutes. But if you permit me just another 7 minutes, I will try and quickly deal with the Social Security Code also, because I had told my co-panelists I would do both the IR code and the Social Security Code. I will just touch the highlights of the Social Security Code. In that, I want to bring to the notice of all the participants present is that, we all use this Uber and Ola, etc. And we've all thought that, they're independent, self-employed people. Therefore, they are not covered within the domain of labor laws, etc. Of course, we are all aware about the recent trend in the UK, where the UK Supreme Court has said that they would be treated as workers. Well, I would say that our Social Security Code, not the Industrial Relations Code, but the Social Security Code deals with gig workers, deals with home-based workers, deals with the aggregator, deals with platform workers. These are the newer concepts. Now, what is going to happen is very simple, that a mechanism will be evolved by the government based upon discussions with both the workers and the employer representatives. We would have specific schemes available to ensure in terms of health insurance, to ensure in terms of old age, pension and provident fund. So these would be some of the newer areas. Of course, the Maternity Benefit Act in 2017 was substantially amended. It gets reflected in the Social Security Code. But I'm a little afraid, and I'll be keenly listening to Saurabh Prakash, who will be speaking after me, because he will be discussing the subject of wages and how would wages be interpreted. My own understanding is that the maternity benefit, which today boldly says that the female employee will get 6 months full salary during the period of maternity, the way I look at it, interpreting the term wage, maybe would she be getting only 50% of what she is currently getting? So these are some of the issues that I wanted to flag with regard to the Social Security Code. One important thing I must clarify is the term, is the gratuity statute. As I just now shared with you, the term wages, as it impacts the Maternity Benefit Act, to my mind, it will have a huge, phenomenal impact on gratuity because of the new definition on wage. What is wage? So I at least will look forward to hearing Saurabh Prakash as to how would he interpret it with regard to the gratuity payment. The gratuity payment, how will it be calculated? I think that will be a major impact. Also, your leave encashment. And yes, now it will be in the statute that end of the year, the employee may even speak and request for leave encashment. So I think these would be some of the major impacts that would come about. I'm deliberately stopping. I know I'm right in the middle of what I'm saying, and I have, Lalit, a lot of things more to share, but I don't want to impinge on the time of the other speakers. I'm purposely stopping here, but I'm available to respond to any queries that the participants may have. Thank you very much, Lalit, for this opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. You very rightly highlighted, you see, the significance of fixed term employment, the setting up of works committee and the grievance redressal committee, which will be more active than which was in the paper, only on paper earlier. under the existing laws. And you also highlighted the peril of having these multiplicity of trade unions and all that. That has been addressed. You spoke about domestic inquiry being confined to 90 days, but my own view is that the laws, you see, they prescribe an industrial dispute to be settled within 90 days or 6 months, but we never achieve that. Under the insolvency code, also certain things have to be resolved within certain time frame. Therefore, if the statutory tribunals and statutory authorities, they don't adhere to these timelines, how can you say that the domestic inquiry is vitiated because you have gone beyond 90 days and all that? So I have great pleasure now in requesting Mr. Saurabh Prakash. I have an emotional attachment with the family because Dr. Anand Prakash, one of the most distinguished lawyers in the field, among other things, in the field of labor laws and service laws, I had the privilege of appearing with him, appearing against him in various, before the various tribunals, industrial tribunals, and in the high courts. And it was always a great learning experience for me because I was still a struggling lawyer in this particular field, and he was already a legend in this field. So Saurabh is the distinguished son of a very distinguished and great lawyer, Dr. Anand Prakash, but in his own right. And apart from the fact that he is son of Dr. Anand Prakash, he's established himself as a senior counsel, particularly in the areas of labor and service law and the computer software and commercial arbitration. He has spent a lifetime. I would not like to use the word lifetime, but that is in his profile. His life is still, you see, many, many more decades to go, and you will have more achievements, you see, to you as you go on. But you have been practicing labor and service laws, including holding negotiations with the union leaders, which is a very, very tough assignment, and even with the teachers. He's a pragmatic lawyer who focuses on finding solutions for the client. Clients these days, they look for solutions. They just don't want your legal advice, whether this is right or whether this is wrong. They also want to know if it is wrong, how can we remedy it? How can we find a solution to it, you see? That is what rightly Saurabh focuses on. So Saurabh, in addition to the two questions or two or three questions which I had posed earlier, my additional queries to you would be, because there is a point of view that the present codes are just, you have put the existing laws into separate codes, you see, with some cosmetic changes. Do they materially deviate from the existing laws, or these are genuinely some cosmetic changes, a codification of the existing laws? Instead of four separate laws, you have now one code dealing with one particular branch of labor laws. So I would like you to also address this issue in your response. Please, over to you, Saurabh.
Thank you, Dr. Bhasin, for the very kind words for my father and for me. And I have heard your name even when I was in school. We used to often hear your name mentioned at the dining table. Because as you are aware, my mother is also a lawyer. So there was a lot of shop talk at home. And I would also mention that I have also known Michael ever since then, because he worked with in my father's chambers for a very long time. And his sister taught me in school. So we have had a special relationship as well. And I would like at this time, I see that Alok has not joined as yet, but I would like to acknowledge the tremendous inputs and assistance I have received from Alok, because ever since these codes were formulated, we have had many brainstorming sessions on what is the effect of various provisions. And the presentation that I have for you is as much, I would say, uh, his work as is mine. But Dr. Bhasin, I will first respond to the questions that you have put, and then we'll see how much time I have remaining for the presentation. I would say that it is a tremendous effort and a highly commendable effort that the government has put in to compress so many laws into 4 codes. It was a Herculean task, but it was one that was required because there was a multiplicity of provisions as well as definitions. And uh, we, because there were different definitions for different acts, there was a lot of conflict and there was a lot of confusion. And how, as you are aware, the courts often take assistance of sister legislation in interpreting provisions. Now, a lot of that is sought to be put at rest by having common definitions, for instance, for wages and worker. There's a definition also for employee, appropriate government, contract labor. So standardization of definitions is a highly commendable thing. However, I do think that as far as wages is concerned, I will be making my presentation. I think that they have made a hash of the definition of wages and how it is to be implemented under the wages code, as we shall see. Um, Other than that, I do not share the enthusiasm that I think Michael has for these laws because, as sir you mentioned, this is mostly a cut and paste job as far as most of the other legislations are concerned. So I don't see anything changing materially over there, except that the definitions will make some disputes redundant. But as you are, as sir you mentioned, the process takes so long in our country. Unless and until some fundamental changes are made to the manner in which we approach disputes and how they are litigated. I'm not talking about mediation and conciliation. I'm talking about litigation. Those that it would be great to resolve them through mediation and conciliation, but those that get litigated, we have to find ways to expedite that process and cut. There's a huge amount of red tape, I would say, in the judiciary or in the judicial system, I would say rather, because as lawyers, we are also part of it. We also, in our own way, contribute to the pendency. So as far as your question about concurrent list is concerned, I think once the 4 codes come into effect, I think most of the state acts would lose their significance, and then they would have to make their own acts afresh, and they would have to receive the assent of the president for them to override. Yes, there would be areas where there would be where the current these 4 codes would be silent, and there, for instance, some provisions of the Shops and Establishments Act may continue to apply, and we would have to be very careful in those areas. Additionally, there would be 2 other areas where I see a I see a tricky problem there because having reduced the threshold from 100 to 300 for the applicability of the former Chapter 5B, as well as for applicability of the standing orders, the question arises, what happens to establishments that had, whether they were observing model standing orders or they had their own certified standing orders, and they were between 100 and 300. Now the Act does not apply to them, but do the previous certified or model standing orders continue to apply to them? And because standing orders also govern issues such as domestic inquiry, payment of subsistence allowance, classification of workers. So would they be suddenly free of those requirements? And also because, so if you do not have standing orders which permit you to reduce the wages of a worker to 50% during while he's suspended, if there is no such provision, you have to pay 100%. So in some circumstances, it is beneficial for the management to have standing orders or at least have service rules which prescribe this. So there would be some gray areas. I think we would have to resolve those. Unfortunately, they are not addressed in the current legislation. But these are, I think, some aspects that still remain open. We do not know how they will get interpreted by the courts. What happens, for instance, to an establishment that had certified standing orders and is now out of the scope of standing orders. So, sir, with those few remarks on the questions that you had posed, I would like to quickly go on to my presentation because I have several slides to present. May I share screen now? Right.
Sir, yes.
Are you able to see my screen now?
Yes, please.
Hold on. Yes. So I will just start the slideshow. These are the 4 legislations that have been amalgamated into the Wages Code. As mentioned, the implementation is yet to be announced and the draft rules are yet to be circulated. Now, there are some new definitions. Some are entirely new and some have been amended, and I have briefly commented on each of these. Appropriate government, what I'm highlighting is the fact that now it expressly says that if there is an establishment for which the appropriate government is the central government, then the contractor that supplies contract labor to that establishment, for that contract labor, the appropriate government shall be the central government. Otherwise, this provision was there in the Industrial Disputes Act, but was not there across other legislation. Therefore, often a question was raised, for instance, whether the state government prescribed minimum wages would be payable to contractors, workers, or the central government prescribed minimum wages. So now this will be addressed because this is standard definition across the 4 codes. Now, under the definition of contractor, and I hope Alok will be able to join us shortly because he will be addressing this question in greater detail. The difference in from the previous definition is that now they have added supplies contract labor for any work of the establishment as mere human resource. So what is the effect of this phrase on the existing interpretations? I will let Alok address. So this is the difference now. Now we come to contract labor, and here there is again this difference from the previous approach. And now contract labor does not include a worker. I will leave this green highlight and gets periodical increment and pay and so on. So this is merely clarifying that the administrative staff of the contractor will be his staff, and that staff cannot make a claim for regular employment for the principal employer. But I do not understand what is meant by other than part-time employee being excluded. So is a part-time employee who's regularly employed by the contractor for his establishment and who gets his periodical increment in pay based on his part-time performance, is he to be treated as contract labor? This seems anomalous, and I hope that this gets corrected or it is addressed and properly clarified. Otherwise, this will lead to some amount of disputes. Now, what they have done is they have 2 definitions. One is of employee, and then there is a definition of worker. Now, here I have noticed that there is some ambiguousness because employee includes supervisory, managerial, administrative, which is fine. I have no difficulty because first they say skilled, semi-skilled, unskilled, manual, operational, then technical, clerical, and so on. And they have also included supervisory, managerial, and administrative, there is no difficulty with that, but does not include any member of of the armed forces of the Union. This is also fine. However, when we look at it in comparison with the definition of worker, which is here, kindly note, here they have included only certain categories: manual, unskilled, skilled, technical, operational, clerical, or supervisory. And later on, they have excluded people, but in the yellow highlighted portion, C and D, does not include any such person who is employed mainly in a managerial or administrative capacity or supervisory, drawing up to 15,000. Fine, there is no difficulty with this. This would be as per the previous definition of workman under the ID Act. Now, kindly see what I have a difficulty with. It says, and includes working journalists and sales promotion employees. However, going back to the definition of employee, these expressions are missing here. Now, are we to understand that working journalists and sales promotion employees are workers, but are not employees? I don't think that that could be the intention. I hope, I do think that there is some error in the drafting, and that would need to be addressed. Because I don't know how it might play out in other aspects of implementing various legislation. Second, when we look at subclauses A and B, does not include a person who's subject to the Air Force Act, Army Act, or Navy Act. So these are the armed forces, right? Does not include any member of the armed forces. However, here another person is excluded who's employed in the police service or as an officer or other employee of a prison. Are we to infer that subcategory B is excluded from worker, but is to be included in employee? Because if that is the case, then as we shall see under the wages code, employees can make claims for wages under the code. That would have the effect that police personnel would be able to file claims under the code, which I again do not think is the intention of the code. So this would also need to be addressed. They would have to look at definition of employer and worker and make them consistent. In my view, the definition of employee should be wider and must include everybody who's a worker, and a worker ought to be a smaller subset of employee. That is not the case as it currently reads, unless you say that when it says includes, that is merely clarificatory, and therefore these would be included in employee also. I would rather not resort to such interpretation and have a clear definition. So this was the question that I have posed. The next slide, these are the various provisions I have highlighted, which are a little difficult to understand. Now I come to the definition of wages, and this is a definition I'm going to take some time over, because we're going to be dealing with claims relating to wages in due course. And there is a very complicated drafting of these provisions. So Dr. Bhasin, I would request you to let me know about 3-4 minutes before my time is up, so I'll try and conclude quickly. So wages means all remuneration.
Please carry on, because this is a very important topic and most of the participants would be interested.
Yes, sir. So whenever you tell me, I will try and conclude in 2 minutes. I will be very happy to complete my presentation. Let's see. So it includes all remuneration, includes, it expressly says, and includes basic pay, dearness allowance, and retaining allowance. And these were the components that were included for under Provident Fund Act also. Now we see what it does not include, but does not include any bonus payable under any law for the time being in force, which does not form part of the remuneration payable under the terms of employment. That means if bonus is payable under the law, such as the Bonus Act, which now forms part of Code on Wages, then that is not wages. However, if it is part of the terms of employment, then it is wages. Now we will see what effect that will have on various other provisions and on calculating the average pay. Because under the Industrial Disputes Act, if you retrench a person, you have to pay him retrenchment compensation on his average pay, which is the average of the previous 3 months' salary, wages. Similarly, under the Gratuity Act, you have to pay him gratuity on his last drawn wages. So if a person, for instance, earns a very high amount of bonus uh, toward the end of his term, it could significantly impact his terminal benefits, because that would be under the terms of employment and not under the Act. Under the Act, he would get from 8.33 to 20%. Now, I will come to value of house accommodation later. Any conveyance allowance and value of any traveling concession. Why I have highlighted this is that the law treats an allowance, a concession, differently from a reimbursement. That is the only reason I highlighted this. But the reimbursement gets addressed in the very next clause. Any sum paid to the employed person to defray special expenses, that is excluded. I can understand there's no difficulty in that. It excludes house rent allowance. Now, some difficult parts. Remuneration payable under any award or settlement between the parties or order of a court or tribunal. Now, this has a very broad sweep in my view. Because if there is, for instance, a dispute relating to wages, which is referred to industrial, and the court passes an award granting wages to workers for a past period, enhanced wages. Why is that not to be treated as wages? I fail to understand. Because this is prescribed by statute. It should at least say unless otherwise prescribed by the award or settlement. I don't know how this would get interpreted without such a saving clause to save settlements and awards which expressly prescribe otherwise. Again, overtime allowance is different from overtime in my view. If a person performs overtime, it would come under all remuneration. Overtime allowance is typically an allowance that is given to a person to agree to perform overtime as and when called upon to do so. So he may be given 1,000 rupees a month extra because he's on the overtime roster that month. But whether or not he gets paid overtime would depend upon whether he performs and how much he performs. So according to me, overtime allowance is excluded, but not overtime itself. Now, there's a question about commission, and Alok has raised a question whether when a person performs, for instance, you have some components of remuneration, where, for instance, you are giving a person a benefit or an incentive to perform during a certain period or beyond a certain period. Performance incentive, or the incentive to come on a rest day and to perform duties. Of course, he'll get substituted rest day. Is that incentive to be treated as a commission, which is excluded, or is it to be treated as a bonus, which forms part of the contract of employment and to be included? So there is some difficulty there. We are not certain how this will get treated. Now, this is not the end of the definition. Now we come to the provisos and the explanation. So provided that for calculating the wages under this clause, if payments made by the employer to the employee under clauses A to I exceed 1/2 of all remuneration calculated under this clause, then the amount which exceeds such 1/2 shall be deemed as remuneration and shall accordingly be added in wages. So it is A to I. Kindly see A to I: bonus, value of house accommodation, contribution to provident fund and pension fund, which is fine, conveyance allowance, special expenses, house rent allowance, settlement between the parties, overtime allowance, commission. Now, Therefore, even the remuneration payable under the settlement or award gets added on. And how will it be added? Now, theoretically, if an award is given with retrospective effect for the last 3 years and the workers get a large lump sum payment today in their hands, the payment actually comes today, but it is for a period of the previous 3 years. How is that to be allocated? That is going to be, I hope that the intention is made clear, at least in the rules, that it would be allocated going back to those 3 years, and it will not get added as a lump sum in that month. Otherwise, that would increase the wages of that person for that 1 month enormously. And it, as I mentioned, could have an effect on retirement benefits. Now, further complication, second proviso. Provided further that for purposes of equal wages to all genders and for the purpose of payment of wages, the emoluments specified in clauses D, F, G, H, I, G, and H shall be taken for computation of wage. Now, let's go back GH, DFGH, conveyance allowance, house rent allowance, award, overtime allowance. Now, finally, the explanation. The value of remuneration in kind, which does not exceed 15% of total wages payable, shall be deemed to form part of the wages of such employee. So you can pay up to 15% in kind, such as whether house accommodation, food, electricity, and so on. The effect will be that it will get counted for purposes of minimum wage and so on, but not more than that, which is fine. So some of these questions I have posed in the next slide. Have these, I will share them with the center. So now I'll come quickly onto other topics. Minimum wage, as Dr. Bhasin mentioned, floor wage can be fixed by the central government for every geographical area. That would be based on the living standards of that area. And even the state government cannot fix minimum wages below that floor wage. There is litigation on the fixation of minimum wage currently about the Delhi wage going on before the Supreme Court. I'm sure these questions will get tested, whether and to what extent the central government can fix wages and whether the wages so fixed are realistic or not. Those questions might arise in future. I won't be able to comment. Now, there's an inspector cum facilitator. This is a new nomenclature. He's also to advise employers and workers. We will see how this plays out. We don't know yet. Web-based inspections will be enabled. Okay, now some changes about the payment of wages. Now there's a time limit of 2 days for settling the dues of an employee who has departed for any reason, whether he is removed, dismissed, retrenched, or resigned. So the provision reads as this: where an employee has been removed or dismissed from service or retrenched or has resigned from service or became unemployed due to closure of the establishment, the wages payable to him shall be paid within 2 working days. So, which is a good thing. There is no ambiguity about this, though, as I have mentioned in the next slide, there could be a question about settling of his terminal dues. Often, if a person is retrenched under Section 25F, we would pay him everything right away. It seems that we can, at least the wages component can be paid 2 days later. I would, however, advise that you pay it immediately regardless. Now, now I come to the payment of bonus. So bonus is essentially the same as under the Bonus Act. All they have done is they've added one ground for disqualification, which is conviction for sexual harassment. And I will hasten to add that conviction does not mean at a domestic inquiry. It means conviction by a criminal court. And if you have dismissed him for after domestic inquiry, he would not be disqualified. If you await the outcome of the criminal trial and he's convicted, and after that you dismiss him, you don't remove him. Dismissal has a legal connotation. If you dismiss him upon conviction, then you can deny him bonus. Now, there are offenses and penalties. They have mostly now also allowed compounding of offenses, especially at least those offenses which are punishable only with fine. And you can compound them on payment of 50%. The only difficulty with compounding that actually arises is that it amounts to a confession. And after that, you will not be able to, the next time around, if you are again brought before a court for the same offense within the next 5 years, then you may face a harsher penalty, including imprisonment, and it would not be permissible for you to contend that the previous occasion you were not guilty, because you have already pleaded guilty and that matter has been closed. So the previous offense has been established. You may now only contest whether or not you have committed a second offense. So this is broadly about the question. Now I come to this main issue, which is, I think, a very tricky one, about the payment of dues. What does this mandate, and what are the manner in which a person can make a claim before under the Code on Wages? Now, Section 43 merely says responsibility for payment of various dues. It says every employer shall pay all amounts required to be paid under this code to every employee employed by him. However, when we go further and we examine what does this code mandate an employer to pay, does it mandate payment of wages, minimum wages, or emoluments? Now, minimum wage, there's a Section 5. No employer shall pay to an employee wages less than minimum rate of wages. He'll have to pay, if there are 2 or more classes of work, he has to pay minimum rate for each class, for the time spent. For piecework, he has to pay minimum time rate. He has to pay over. Now, where an employee whose minimum rate of wages has been fixed under this code performs overtime, then you must pay overtime rate, which is not less than twice. What about a person whose minimum rate of wages has not been fixed? There is no mandate that you will pay him twice the overtime with the normal rate. Now, do you go back to the Shops and Establishments Act and say, now I'm nevertheless entitled under the Shops and Establishments Act to receive twice? That is a question that could arise. So then there's mode of payment and there is time limit of payment. Then there is payment of bonus. So there is no further provision regarding what is the liability of the employer to pay. Now we come to the question, to two provisions, Section 57 and 59, from which we have to gather what it is that the employee or the worker can demand or file a claim for. And these are very problematic provisions. That is why I've highlighted them both on the same page. So first of all, Section 57 bars other suits. However, it says no court shall entertain any suit. And a court, there are a number of judgments. What is a court? A Shops and Establishments Authority may or may not be a court. And it, in my view, also does not entertain a suit. So it may not be forbidden to a person to file such a claim before a Shops and Establishments Authority. Now we see further. No court shall entertain any suit for the recovery of minimum wages. So one, it is minimum wages, any deduction from wages, discrimination in wages, and payment of bonus. Now, if there is payment of, if I pay as an employer, I pay the minimum wage, and we have seen that the definition of wages is very complex. Suppose I pay to him all the components that fall within wages, but I don't pay certain other components which are otherwise emoluments. Then where does the person go? Now, we will see what are the components, because I'll come to the next page, because there was a definition with exclusions and then there were provisos and explanations. So it's a very complex. Here we see, it says, if it could have been recovered under this code, So this question will have to be determined if a person files a suit. An objection can be raised, wait a minute, you could have raised this under the code. And that person will have to show that he could not have raised it under the code. On the other hand, if he files a suit, if he files a claim under the code, the employer may go and say, wait a minute, what is it that you are seeking recovery of? This is not minimum wage. I have not made a deduction from wages. I have made deduction from other components. This is not a case of discrimination and not a case of bonus. So what have you filed this case about? Now, with this in mind, kindly see section 59. Where a claim has been filed on account of non-payment of remuneration. Now, suddenly the word remuneration comes instead of wages. Now, how are we to interpret this? Non-payment of wages or bonus or less payment of wages. So in section 59, they have used both the expressions remuneration first time, next time wages. So according to rules of interpretation, normally they ought to receive different interpretations. However, doing that is going to pose a lot of difficulty, and I hope that some of these issues are resolved by amendment. Or on account of making deductions not authorized by this code from the wages. Again, they're talking about wages. So there is a provision regarding what deductions may be made from wages. So this is what I have addressed in the next slide about what is this difference between remuneration and wages. And in this context, I want to come to the proviso that we had seen to the definition of wages. Because it said, provided further, that for the purpose of equal wages to all genders, and for the purpose of payment of wages, the emolument specified in clauses D, F, G, and H shall be taken for computation of wage. So it is only for payment for purpose of equal wages to genders and for payment of wages. So when we are talking about claims relating to wages, these emoluments shall be taken into consideration, though they will not be taken into consideration for calculation of certain other things. Now, what are these D, F, G, and H? Basically, what I've done is I've brought together all the other components which are not mentioned over here. These are bonus, which I mean the statutory bonus, because the bonus that is contractual is included in wages. Statutory bonus is not included. The value of house accommodation has been excluded. Pension or provident fund has been excluded. If any payment to defray special expenses excluded. Commission, gratuity, and retrenchment compensation. These are the exclusions, which is on the ones that I've highlighted in yellow now on this page. I can understand that there is a valid basis. There is no difficulty. Bonus can be recovered under the code on wages regardless, because it specifically says you can file a claim for bonus. Pension or provident fund can be recovered under the code on social security. Gratuity can be recovered under the code on social security. Retrenchment compensation can be recovered under the industrial relations code. What about value of house accommodation? Any compensation for defraying special expenses and commission. And we come back to commission, as I mentioned, the question that Alok had posed, whether commission, whether an incentive is a commission or a bonus. So we get into a very complex mix. Now, so the net effect is that even supervisory, managerial, and administrative employees will have to invoke the mechanisms under this code, because as we noted, section 57 bars the filing of suits because it can be recovered under this code. And employees are also covered, therefore they will not be able to go in any other alternate mechanism if it can be filed here. However, it may be possible to file before the Shops and Establishments Authority. We will know in time whether that interpretation is given. Likewise, people who are employed in the police service or as an officer or other employee of a prison, according to me, on the plain reading, should be able to file because he's an employee. He's not a worker. Does not matter because under the wages code, every employee should be able to file. So now, according to me, this is what is these are the difficulties in the present act, and I hope that these get addressed because question of wages is going to impact every other act. All the 4 acts, the definition is common, and it's not only about the recovery of wages, it is also about the impact on other components. Thank you very much, Dr. Bhasin. Thank you for giving me the extra time also. I'm very grateful, and I think Alok has joined.
Thank you, Saurabh. I think it was a very elaborate, detailed presentation on very complex issues which have arisen or which are likely to arise when the code is put into place. I agree with you when you say it is a cut and paste exercise done, and they have made a hash of the wages and to see what can be covered. But states will have to amend, you see, or repeal their laws so that there is no apparent conflict, particularly between the provisions of the Shops and Establishments Act, you see, and the codes. You very rightly pointed out the confusion particularly in the field of wages. What can be claimed, what cannot be claimed, what is included, what is excluded, and all those. Well, anyway, it is a good scope for lawyers, you see, to keep on interpreting, but not good, you see, for harmonious relations between employers and employees. And you very rightly pointed out that how can you not include remuneration under settlements or awards as a part of wages? The settlements generally, you see, they connect, they lay down what will be, say, in the next 5 years, what will be the pay scales, what will be the increments, what will be that. They essentially pertain to wages. So how can that be excluded? And also you refer to the explanation. One question I want to pose to Alok, particularly in addition to, I think, what Saurabh has left for you to decide to speak on, particularly contract labor and other issues, is what will be the effect of the existing settlements which are in place now after 1st April 2021 if the codes are implemented? Because as per the Supreme Court judgment way back in DJ Bahadur's case versus LIC, Supreme Court has put the settlements at higher pedestal, even higher than the legislations. They say these settlements are sacrosanct. So supposing there is a settlement which goes up to the year 2025 or 26, now will those settlements stand abrogated, or what will be the status of those settlements? So I would like to request Alok. Alok, you have about exactly 20 minutes. If you can please share your views with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
I must share with the participants, Alok is engaged very actively in the practice of labor and employment laws from the year 1985. He has authored 3 books. First is Law Relating to Contract Labor, Law Relating to Sexual Harassment at Work, which had a foreword by Honorable Justice J.S. Verma, former Chief Justice of India, and on Labor and Employment Laws, a primer. In the book India, the Business Opportunity, he has contributed a chapter on labor and employment laws in India. So it is a befitting participation from one of the most eminent lawyers in this field, and I think our participant would greatly benefit from that. So over to you, Alok.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhasin, for the very kind introduction. Am I audible?
Yes. Audible and audible.
Well, okay. So I'll just give a general overview of the law relating to contract labor, how it has developed over the years in India, and what changes are proposed to be made by the present labor codes. Well, contract labor is not a recent or a new phenomenon. It has always existed worldwide as well as in India in various economic sectors. However, for a variety of reasons, we see that there has been a rapid proliferation of the phenomenon of contract labor, particularly from the 1980s onwards. Now, while taking recourse to contract labor would certainly enable an employer to improve its competitive position and inject an element of flexibility in its operations, at the same time, recourse to contract labor may expose the contract workers to certain abuses. In particular, recourse to contract labor may imply shifting of employer obligations from an enterprise which is more capable of bearing the onerous employer obligations to an enterprise which may not be in a position to bear all these obligations. All over the world, including India, largely two techniques are used to protect the interests of contract labor. One technique is to provide for artificial or extended definition of employer and employee. So an artificial definition is given by a statute, the effect of which is that the workers of the contractor are also included in the definition of employee, so that the principal employer, the principal establishment is obliged to comply with the provisions of such statute in relation to contract labor as well. For instance, in India, we have the Employees Provident Funds and Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1952, where you see Section 2F defines employee, that employee means any person employed for wages for any kind of work, manual or otherwise, in or in connection with the work of the establishment, and who receives his wages directly or indirectly from the employer, and includes any employee employed by or through a contractor. So this is an example of an artificial or extended definition of employer-employee concept, where the contractor's employees may become the employees of the principal employer for the limited purposes of the Provident Funds Act. Similarly, Section 2, Clause 9 of the ESI Act, the Employees State Insurance Act 1948, also has an artificial or extended employment concept definition. The effect of it is, if the contractor's employee is either employed on the premises of the factory or establishment, or under the supervision of the employer or his agent for any work which is ordinarily a part of the establishment, or which is preliminary to the work carried on in the establishment, or which is incidental to the purpose of the establishment, then again such contractor's employee would fall in the definition of employee. So PF and ESI, both these enactments, they have these artificial or extended employment concepts to protect the interest of contract labor. Even Factories Act, for that matter, Section 2L worker, it includes the contractor's employees as well in certain circumstances. The Employees Compensation Act, which provides for compensation for work-related injuries, Section 12, that also has a provision that the contract worker may claim against the principal employer as well. And of course, the principal employer in turn has a right to be indemnified from the contractor, who is the real employer, actual employer. The other technique is to protect the interests of contract labor by having a specific enactment for the purpose. Like in India, currently, we have the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act 1970, which is an act to regulate the employment of contract labor in certain establishments and to provide for its abolition in certain circumstances and for matters connected therewith. Now, you see, before the enactment of the Contract Labor Act, the industrial adjudicators under the Industrial Disputes Act were adjudicating disputes relating to regulation and abolition of contract labor. The Supreme Court, in the seminal case of Standard Vacuum Refining Company, I think it is of 1960, held that dispute raised by the direct workers of the principal employer demanding abolition of contract labor would nevertheless be an industrial dispute, even though the dispute has been raised for the benefit of the contractor's employees who are not the employees of the principal establishment. So the Supreme Court said that the direct workers have a class interest with the contractors' workers, and the direct workers, they also have some stake as to how the employer should carry on the business. And therefore, the direct workers of the principal establishment can raise a dispute for abolition of contract labor as well as for regularization, absorption of the contract labor in the principal establishment. It will be an industrial dispute. Now, you see, in Standard Vacuum Refining Company, this petroleum refinery, it engaged a contractor and it basically outsourced the sweeping and cleaning of the premises. And the industrial tribunal passed an award directing the employer to abolish the contract labor system. The matter ultimately went to Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court upheld the tribunal's award for abolition of contract labor. The Supreme Court said that it is immaterial that the contract labor was not engaged in the manufacturing process. The Supreme Court said that sweeping and cleaning is a work which is incidental to or necessary for the manufacturing process. In this case, it was perennial in nature. It was of sufficient volume that full-time employees could be employed, and other establishments also employed direct employees for doing this work. Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, all right. So the Supreme Court said that in these circumstances, the industrial tribunal was justified to abolish contract labor system. The principal employer said that, well, it's a genuine contract, not a sham or a camouflage. The Supreme Court said that hardly matters. Because it's a genuine contract, that is why
Everyone except the speaker, everyone mute yourselves. Please mute yourselves. Yeah, carry on.
The Supreme Court said that because it's a genuine contract, that is why we are asking you to abolish the contract with prospective effect after 2 months. Otherwise, we would have held that being a sham contract or a camouflage, the contractors, so-called contractors, workers were always deemed to have been the direct workers. And so, while giving direction to the principal employer to abolish contract labor, the Supreme Court said that since now anyways after the contract labor is abolished, the principal employer has to make fresh recruitments. So the principal employer will give preference to the erstwhile contract labor while making appointments. Now you see, this judgment of the Supreme Court in Standard Vacuum Refining Company case, it formed the entire basis of Section 10 of the Contract Labor Act. Because this Contract Labor Act, as I said, basically deals with regulation and abolition of contract labor. And Section 10 is the only section which deals with abolition of contract labor. And Section 10 says that the appropriate government may, after consultation with the central or state advisory contract labor board, may by notification in the official gazette prohibit the employment of contract labor in any process, operation or other work in any establishment. And then it says that before issuing a notification, the appropriate government shall have regard to the terms and conditions of contract labor, plus certain relevant factors, namely that whether the process, operation or other work is incidental to or necessary for the industry carried on, or it's perennial in nature, and so on and so forth. The same factors which the Supreme Court had laid down in Standard Vacuum Refining Company matter. Then as regards the regulation of contract labor, the scheme of the Contract Labor Act is that the principal employer has to apply for registration, contractor has to apply for license, and the act applies if 20 or more contract labor are employed, and the contractor is responsible for providing the welfare amenities and facilities as well as the wages. But if the contractor fails to do so, then the principal employer becomes liable, and in turn the principal employer is entitled to recover the expenses from the contractor. Now, you see, once the Indian economy opened, so with the economic onslaught unleashed by multinationals and global giants, Indian employers started clamoring for more and more flexibility in their dealings with employees. And in particular, they demanded that the provisions of the Contract Labor Act should be made less stringent and more flexible, and they should be given a free hand to engage contract labor, particularly in their peripheral operations. The demands of the employers reached a virtual crescendo when, you see, in 1997, a three-judge bench of the Supreme Court held that if the principal employer takes recourse to contract labor, notwithstanding abolition of contract labor by the appropriate government, the contract labor shall automatically become the employees of the principal employer. So there was a veritable uproar, and the employers, they said, well, this is virtually amending the Contract Labor Act itself, because the act doesn't contain any provision which envisages creation of direct employer-employee relation between the principal employer and the contractor, contract labor. It is a different matter if the contract is a sham. In that case, it is a disguised relationship. Of course, in that case, it can be held that the contract labor were always the employees of the principal employer. A flexible model of a firm was sought to be devised, which enabled the employer to segment its activities on a core and periphery pattern. The model suggested that the core of the firm would comprise of permanent employees, and such employees would have skills which are central to the core competency of the firm, and which would enable the employer to expand its core competency, while the periphery would comprise of temporary employees or contingent employees or contract labor contractors employees. And so the core would provide functional flexibility while the periphery would provide numerical flexibility. But the Supreme Court rejected the contention that this concept of core activity and peripheral activity can be invoked for the purposes of abolishing contract labor, because Supreme Court said that as far as, if the relevant factors mentioned in Section 10 are satisfied, it would be open to the appropriate government to abolish contract labor. Now, this contract labor is now a part of the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code. If and when the OSHW code comes into effect, the Contract Labor Act shall stand repealed, and certain important changes are sought to be made in the law relating to contract labor by this particular code. Number one, this code introduces the concept of core activity. Now, this code says that contract labor shall stand prohibited in the core activity of the principal employer. And then they define core activity. Section 2P of this OSHW code, it says, core activity of an establishment means any activity for which the establishment is set up and includes any activity which is essential or necessary to such activity. Then the provision says that the following shall not be considered as essential or necessary activity if the establishment is not set up for such activity, namely sanitation works, including sweeping, cleaning, dusting and collection of and disposal of all kinds of wastes, then watch and ward security services, canteen and catering services, loading and unloading operations, running of hospitals, educational and training institutions, guest houses, clubs. Of course, it says that as long as these are in the nature of support services, then courier services, which are in the nature of support services, civil and other constructional works, including maintenance, gardening and maintenance of lawns and other activities, housekeeping and laundry services, transport services, and any activity of intermittent nature, even if that constitutes core activity of an establishment. So now, see, this is actually, this amendment or this provision in this code is actually inspired by the Andhra Pradesh amendment, which the Andhra Pradesh Legislative Assembly carried out in the year 2003. Because the Andhra Pradesh Assembly, it amended contract labor way back in 2003 and incorporated a similar provision that the contract labor will be prohibited only in the core activity and not in the peripheral activities. But even regarding core activity, it would be permissible for the principal employer to take recourse to a contract labor system, provided the normal functioning of the establishment is such that the activity is ordinarily done through contractor, or the activities are such that they do not require full-time workers for the major portion of the working hours in a day or for longer periods, or if there is any sudden increase of volume of work in the core activity, which needs to be accomplished in a specified time. So this is a substantial change in the law regarding abolition of contract labor, and plus now this contract labor regulation and abolition law would apply only where 50 or more contract labor are employed. Then now, since contract labor is a part of this code, there will be no need for the principal employer to have a separate registration for the purposes of contract labor. One registration under this code will be sufficient, but yes, contractor has to get a license, and contractor may get an All India license. It is open to the contractor to apply for an All India license, or he may even get a license specific to the particular work. And now the duration of the license would be for 5 years. Now, I'll just take to, is there some time left?
No, I think you may just wind up because another session
Right.
in 5
Oh, I
minutes.
see. So I'll just take 2 minutes. That now you see, in the Contract Labor Act, there was no provision that the principal employer should ensure that the contractor is a licensed contractor. But now under this code, there's a specific provision that if the principal employer enters into a contract with a contractor who is not licensed, then you see this will be a violation of the provisions of the code. Then under the Contract Labor Act, it was the obligation of the contractor to provide welfare facilities to the contract labor. But now under the code, it is the principal employer's responsibility to provide welfare facilities to the contract labor. And if the principal contractor doesn't pay the wages, then now it is open to the appropriate government to pass order that out of the security amount which contractor has deposited, the amount can be paid to the contract labor. So with these, I would conclude my session and extend my thanks to the organizers and Dr. Lalit Bhasin.
Yeah, thank you, Alok. I think it was a brilliant presentation on this very complex issue as to what constitutes, you see, contract labor. There's so much of litigation going on, so many judgments of the Supreme Court, which have not brought about any clarity, or on the other hand, they have created a lot of confusion. There are still gray areas. Hopefully, these would be resolved under the new code. You have highlighted the concept of core activity. Core activity concept was always there, even pre the Contract Labor and Regulation Act. As you rightly said, standard vacuum is a case, I think, which was prior in point of time to the enactment of the Contract Labor Act. And it had laid down core activities you cannot, you see, put on contract labor because that is your essential activity. Yes, peripheral activities, and which may not be of a perennial nature, can be, you see, given out on contract basis. It was a brilliant presentation, and I am sure you see that our participants have gained significantly